Okay, this video is on Michel Foucault, who is a 20th century French philosopher. We read a chapter called Panopticism, which comes from his book, Discipline and Punish. So this essay, this chapter starts out by recalling what the Panopticon is. And the Panopticon was a type of prison kind of strangely conceived by a utilitarian philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. And they really did build these prisons, and they're still around. And what the prison is imagine the inside of a prison, let's say like a big warehouse room, and then you have a tower in the center of the room. You have a tower in the center of the room, and then in front of the tower, or all around it, all around the tower, 360, you have prison cells stacked on one another, but in a circular architectural structure. And so you have someone who's inside the tower. The tower is called the Panopticon. Maybe the Panopticon is the whole sort of system, but key to it is this notion of a tower. And in that tower, there are prison guards. And so, because the view in the tower is 360 and the prison cells are 360 and they're level, they're stacked, then there's a view from the tower into the cells. Now, is there a view from the cells into the tower? No, because key to the Panopticon is a big, bright, shining light that's coming from the tower that's sort of blinding in a way. So what it does is it illuminates what's in the cell, but it blocks what is in the tower. So what this does is, we're talking about surveillance of prisoners. And what it does is it allows the prisoners to think that they're being watched at all times, because they cannot confirm whether or not there's a prison guard in the tower. Why? Because of the big, bright, shining light that's basically blinding them. So if you are recognizing you're in a technological situation where you could always be being watched, but you don't necessarily know, you can't confirm whether or not you are, what do you think your reaction is going to be? Your reaction is going to be to act like you were always being watched. And there's a basic sort of principle in psychology that people's behavior changes when they are being observed. Now, of course, since we're talking about prisons, then the sort of behavioral outcome that the prison design is supposed to induce is that the prisoners behave themselves, whether or not there's a guard in the tower. Now, the point, too, is that if there is a guard in the tower, there really just needs to be one guard in the tower, because one guard can see into each cell, right? It's not like old school prison setup systems where you need maybe one prison guard for every, 3 to 5 to 10 prisoners. So what this does, what the Panopticon does, is that it maximizes efficiency. I just said that you could have one doing the job of watching all the prisoners, but the whole point of not being able to confirm whether or not an officer is in the tower means that you don't even necessarily need one prison guard to make the prisoners think that they're being watched if you just have that light shining down on them. All right, so this was a type of prison that Jeremy Bentham made called the Panopticon. By the way, pan means all, opticon means, vision or visual, so panoptic means all seeing. So, that was a type of prison. What is Foucault up to? Foucault is saying this: I'm going to take the idea of that physical prison, the Panopticon, and I'm going to use it as a lens through which to critique society. And I'm going to highlight a phenomenon, sort of like something that happens in society, and that phenomenon he calls Panopticism. Okay? Panopticism. So the Panopticon is the literal prison. Panopticism is a social theory, a mechanism of understanding something that is going on in society. So what is that something? Well, that something it must have to do with surveillance, or else it wouldn't be called panopticism. So what Foucault is highlighting is basically what we would now call the surveillance state that we're living in. So there are many different facets to the surveillance state. There are literal people or cameras watching us, but they're not always merely just those things watching us. So the first division I want to highlight is, let's say, cameras versus non-literal types of surveillance mechanisms. Another division I want to highlight is the difference between, let's say, the public and the private panopticon. The public panopticon was going to have to do with the government, and the private panopticon is going to have to do with private corporations. So I'm laying these divisions out right now, and then now I'm going to unpack them. So, isn't it funny we're talking about the surveillance state as I'm using my phone and this ridiculous selfie stick to make this lecture for y'all? We all have cameras on our smartphones. It allows us to take pictures, it allows us to take videos. When you are out in the public space, you are, as the First Amendment guarantees, you are subject to be documented and surveyed in various ways. Anyone can take a picture of you, anyone can start taking a video of you. It may be rude, it may be invasive, but that is the freedom of the press, that is the freedom of documentation. So we also know that there are cameras in stores. We go to some store like Target or whatever, and we see the cameras in there. We see cameras, let's say, outside buildings, right? I was just, I went to Europe and I was delayed in New York for a couple days, and there are, cameras everywhere. There are cameras on our campus. There are more cameras in bigger cities is what I'm saying, like, let's say, at traffic lights. I think there's maybe a couple around Springfield, but in Chicago, I used to live there, there's maybe one at 20% of the lights, so that's kind of high. So those are examples of the Panopticon. So okay, and so just to take a step back for a second, remember that in the last video on Kant, I said that Foucault and these other philosophers are going to be highlighting things that are in the social world that obstruct our ability to think for ourselves, that get in the way of our autonomy. And the whole point of reading Panopticism in this context is to highlight that the surveillance state gets in the way of our autonomy. So back to different kinds of cameras. So you think about this. Do you think that there is actually a camera in every single little bubble on the ceiling of Target or Walmart or wherever you go? Now, the little bubble that I'm talking about, the little black lens kind of semicircle bubble that's over the camera, certainly suggests that there's a camera there. But there may not actually be a camera. And how about this? Even if there is a camera, do you think that there is, a team of people in the back room somewhere diligently watching in real time? Maybe, but of course, if it records everything anyway and you can dip into it later on, you don't necessarily need someone monitoring it in real time. But what I'm getting at is, do you think the cameras are there to catch people, to prevent people, and what people do you think cameras in stores are actually there to police? Do you think it's there to police customers, or do you think it's there to police, this guy's tearing it up, employees? And what most people will tell you that have some experience is that most of the cameras in stores like that are actually there to police their own employees, because the rich, deep cultural fecundity of Springfield. I don't want to go this way anyway. So the point is, we have all these cameras everywhere. Sometimes we think the cameras are on our side, like if we're employees, but sometimes we don't even realize that they're there to police us. And, you know, it's not necessarily like we're all potential thieves, but if you were thinking about stealing something, you would recognize the camera at least operates as a kind of deterrent, even if no one is watching you in real time. So again, this idea that the surveillance state no longer requires actual human eyes, but relies on a certain kind of technology, and that technology, although it is outside of us, it affects the inside of us. It affects our thinking and what we might decide to do. Now I want to mention the public versus the private types of the Panopticon. So let's talk about the public Panopticon, as in the government. So, do you think that the government surveys you? Do you think the government has ways to tap your phones, to tap into your computer history, to see what you search for, to go through your iPhone? There was a Supreme Court case recently, you know, if you get pulled over and you get your car searched, does that mean you could get your phone searched as well? And I think the Supreme Court ruled that no, you cannot, but I have to double check on that. So I think we would all recognize that indeed the government absolutely has the technology and the ability to do this. And if you know anything about recent history in the last 20 years, you know that after 9/11 we passed all these laws to sort of give up some of our privacy issues under the Patriot Act, and the whole sort of situation with Edward Snowden, and that particular case of WikiLeaks was that he, who was some kind of like FBI agent, you know, found out the depth to which the government was monitoring citizens, and discovering, you know, sometimes it's like you don't get your stuff searched unless you, let's say, do something wrong. But then you have a bunch of people who, you know, have access to this technology, and, you know, they're there working on a Tuesday and they might be bored, so they start to dig up information on people they know, or ex-boyfriends, girlfriends that they had. And so what Snowden publicized, is the depth to which the government does survey citizens, especially post 9/11, through the mechanism of the Patriot Act. So, you know, maybe you don't want to actually hurt anybody or steal something, but maybe you're curious about how something is made. Like maybe you're curious, maybe, you know, for whatever reason you're curious about, let's say, how a bomb is made. And you might wonder, like, what kinds of things are combustible? But knowing, let's say, the government might monitor certain kinds of searches for combustible material, you don't research how to make bombs, at least you don't use the internet to do it, because you're afraid of repercussions. This is a sense then in which the surveillance state can keep you from discovering information that you might be curious about. Or let's say you're curious about, you know, like how to grow marijuana or something like that. You consider Googling it, but you err on the side of caution because, you know, who knows? This is the sense in which the social atmosphere can impede our autonomy and then even obstruct the kind of knowledge that we get. Okay, so now to the private Panopticon. There's some kind of crossover with Google, and so I was just talking about Googling things and the possibility of the government monitoring you. But let's say, has this happened to you? Have you been in a situation where, I have someone that wants to join the video. Have you been in a situation where you were thinking about buying something? So I was in a situation where I wanted to buy a very specific kind of shoes and was having trouble finding it. And so I couldn't really find the shoes on my own. And then like 3 days later, in the margins of Facebook, in the margins of different web pages I was on are, you know, ads for the kind of shoes I was looking for. And all of a sudden, you know, they're like, you know, right in front of me. They're right in front of me. And so, how did they get there? Well, I'm sure y'all are, you know, as millennials growing up with all this technology, y'all are smart enough to realize that Google and other companies run these algorithms such that they try to give you, you know, consumer pages that they think that you're going to be interested in, and they send ads your way based on the things that you Google, right? So this is called the private Panopticon because these are private corporations that want us to consume certain things, want us to consume products, and they use the kind of information we seek out to sell us stuff. So a sense in which our private consumer habits are being monitored, right? Now, you might say, well, didn't you get the shoes that you wanted, and why is that such a bad thing? Well, that is a good point. First of all, I haven't yet bought them, but it was certainly easier to find them when they sent them my way. But, you know, not everybody necessarily, like, their various concerns in life are not simply, did I get the consumer products that I was looking for, but do I have a sense of privacy in which whatever I do decide to buy maybe is not put into a certain kind of database that is then, let's say, sold off to other corporations or other types of businesses, you know, and that kind of thing happens a lot. I was just reading an article in the Times about people that apply to Harvard and Harvard's admission process, and how schools and different companies, I mean, in this case it's Harvard, but different companies do this as well, take our information, our age, our occupations, maybe our various interests, and they sell that information to different parties, all for the purpose of a kind of sort of recruitment through consumption habits, right? So what we just went over then is a lot of different ways in which we, in what you know, Foucault and Marcuse call this technological society, this society that is really characterized by a different kind of, new kind of technology that is more intrusive, more invasive, more pervasive. So it is more penetrating within us, and it is all around us, almost everywhere, certainly right in front of me right now. So the point then is, in Foucault's terms, all this surveillance makes us behave. And it makes us behave at a lower cost than having more, you know, cops on the beat would make people behave. And just like it makes prisoners docile and obedient, it makes citizens docile and obedient. And so, you know, maybe you're upset with the political climate, maybe you're not, maybe you have been in the past, maybe you will be in the future, and maybe you'd like to somehow express that frustration, but you might be too intimidated to do certain things because you'll be put on a list and surveyed, you'll be marked, you'll be maybe blacklisted, or, you know, so these kinds of concerns are real worry, and some people might be more prone toward, they'd like to do certain courageous acts that go against the sort of status quo, the state of things, but the surveillance state impedes them. So through this video, I've talked about different ways in which the Panopticism, which we understand as the surveillance state, which is in the social world, which is outside of us, but ends up affecting our minds, what we think and what we do. So we're talking about that as a major impediment to autonomy. And again, because it's on the outside of us, we can pit that against what Kant says about autonomy, thinking for oneself, and enlightenment only being about what is inside of us, that is our internal process of thinking for ourselves. So what I want you to take away from this video and Panopticism in general is, where do you see the surveillance state? Where is it? What kinds of things have you noticed about, let's say, literal cameras everywhere, or, you know, like, not only like a camera in Target or whatever, but like your friend takes out a camera and, you know, how do you react to that? Do you jump in the frame really quickly? Are you worried about where it's going to be posted? Or is there just so much crap and video and content out there that at this point you don't really, you're not really bothered by it too much? But for the purposes of the paper, the question will be, what are the ways in which panopticism as a social phenomenon gets in the way of individuals thinking for themselves, and I'm glad I brought it back to that, and really being individual, you know, being themselves, being true to themselves, becoming individuals, you know, in the way that like Mill highlighted too, but now we're up against this very invasive technology. Alright, so we'll end it there, and stay tuned for the video on Adorno, Horkheimer, and then Marcuse.